Hello, good afternoon. It's Monday, and that would be July 27th, 2020. It's a little story I want to tell, something that happened back in the 1980s, which is very indicative of what is happening today and this atmosphere that we're having politically. In 1980, when I got out of college, I joined an association called the Fusion Energy Foundation, which was a organization that published a magazine, and they had research scientists that worked for them that would write articles about the progress of fusion energy. And I doubt if anybody probably knows what fusion energy is now. It's the energy of the sun. It is the situation where you have hydrogen under tremendous pressure to the point where the hydrogen atoms begin to fuse and they turn into helium, and what you end up getting is like the difference between an atomic bomb and a hydrogen bomb. The hydrogen bomb is much more powerful than an atomic bomb. So when you're dealing with an energy source, that would be the ultimate energy source. If we could come up with that, that would be completely revolutionary. Now, companies and the government has been working on it for a long time. It doesn't seem to be going anywhere lately because there's so many of the budgets have been cut. So from that point on, I started learning about science, and I started learning about the government and how things were working and why governments wanted to do certain things and why they didn't want to do certain things. And from that point, I met a guy named Lyndon LaRouche. Maybe you remember him, maybe you don't. If you're a younger person, you probably don't, because he's pretty much been erased from history. But he started an organization back in the late 60s, early 70s. He was he taught at Columbia University. He taught economics, and had a group of students around him that started an organization called the International Caucus of Labor Committees, because he was much like Richard Wolff is today. If you want to look up Richard Wolff on YouTube, you'll find a lot of his speeches that he gives, lectures. He's, I think, got a channel now, and he does teach Marxism. And a lot of people have this crazy notion that Marxism is somehow like communism or like the Soviet Union. And the basic idea of Marx was something that probably nobody understands, because it's been taught a certain way. Things that go on in this country and other places in the world, they use a lot of little acronyms and little sayings, or put people into boxes. And so anytime you hear the word Marxism, you probably think something really horrible. Oh my God, Marxist, Leninist, you think of all these things. But what Marx did was he identified the problems of capitalism and how capitalism will ultimately lead to feudalism. If capitalism is not controlled and is not regulated, eventually it will happen. That's what will happen. It'll end up being into feudalism. And you should, look at a dictionary and find out what is feudalism, because there's a lot of difference between communism, fascism, socialism, Marxism. Every one of these isms have particular, they have certain aspects about them that are different from others. And socialism and Marxism kind of are a lot alike, because what you've got in Marxism was that it showed how that capitalism, unregulated, is non-democratic, because what you've got is you've got a CEO, you've probably got a board of directors on the large corporations, and then you've got your stockholders. And so it's not a democracy. You get hired by this company, you're told what to do, and you're told how much you're going to make. And if you don't do what they say, or you ask for a raise and they don't want to give you one, then they just fire you. They can do whatever they want in a corporation. And that was part of the thing that Marx identified as the problem. Because when you have an undemocratic structure of a corporation, what ends up happening is if they see a place like China or Mexico, Vietnam now is a really big haven for what can be termed as slave labor. Because if you pay someone so little that they can barely survive, maybe live in a cardboard box, they get a couple of bowls of rice a day just to maintain existence, then that's essentially slave labor, because it's so little. But see, the corporations don't care, because what their main goal is profit. Their main goal is to maximize profits for the owners and the stockholders. They really could care less about the employees, except they need employees to make the product or perform the service that they are in business to do. So what ends up happening is that a company or a corporation will be formed here in the United States, and if the owners decide that they can make that product cheaper in China, then they'll just shut the factory down, lay off all the workers, move the factory to China. But what ends up happening is that the workers in China don't do very well. Certainly the people that are laid off here in the United States don't do very well. But the owners can maximize their profits. They can make a lot more profit, and the stockholders can make a lot more profit. And that is what capitalism, unregulated, what they call unbridled or free trade capitalism. There is no such thing as free trade. You need to understand that, because if you are trying to make a product here in the United States where your labor costs are higher because our standard of living is higher, and then you are trying to compare that to a country like Vietnam, which has very little infrastructure, their wages are very small, very low, they don't have benefits, etc., etc., that is called an uneven playing field. But when somehow Americans hear the word free, they think, oh, well, that means that it must be freedom, and that's American, free, free, free. We must be free to do whatever we want. Well, we are getting screwed. And so what happened back in the 60s and the 70s was Lyndon LaRouche had identified this problem. It was beginning to happen, particularly in the 70s. Things were starting to fall apart in the 70s. And one of the things that some of you may remember was the oil crisis, or the oil shortage. It was manufactured. There was no oil shortage. What had happened was that Henry Kissinger had worked with Saudi Arabia and a couple other countries over there, had decided that they needed to raise the price of oil so that these countries could buy weapons from us. That was what happened. So what they did was they created an artificial shortage so that the prices would go up, and the prices doubled. That allowed Saudi Arabia and other countries to be able to buy weaponry. That was what it was all about. So when companies started paying politicians, your lobbies, to try and push this idea that, look, if we move our factories to China, the products that we sell in the United States will be cheaper, Americans can afford them, and so things will be better. And it's a ridiculous notion. A lot of people believe it. They think it's awesome. I have a friend of mine, he just He doesn't get it. He thinks that buying stuff from China, having tariffs, is a bad thing because that raises the price of goods to the consumer here in the United States. Well, that is true. But the downside is that the labor is lowered in the United States. So the people that are getting laid off end up getting jobs paying less. They can afford less. They can afford less of what's coming, what's being made. So they end up getting addicted to the cheap Chinese crap that's coming in. It used to be Japanese back in the 50s and the 60s. They were known as making a lot of cheap crap. They're not anymore. That's moved over to China. Well, China is beginning to grow, and their labor rates are starting to rise. And so now the capitalists are looking for new slave labor pools, cheap labor pools, which would be like Vietnam and Bangladesh and different places like that, really horrible working conditions. So he identified that and started publishing information about what was going on and the real truth about what was going on. This obviously in the early 70s and the 80s, way before computers and the internet and YouTube and all that. So there was really no way to get good information except through publications like newspapers and television. A lot of that was propaganda. Some of it was pretty good back then. But what LaRouche was able to do, because he had connections with different military people, he had connections with different politicians. He was well known in the world because he was able to set up a security system. He consulted with different leaders of countries setting up security for them, because he understood that if you were a politician that was bucking the system, like what happened to Iran in 1953, that they would take you out. And so he had figured out ways of preventing that from happening. Things like moving your schedule around, never keeping the same schedule all the time. There was a lot of things that you can do to thwart assassination. So when he started publishing a lot of this information, there was the rich and powerful back then didn't like it, because what he was doing was identifying what they were doing. And to have a population that knows what's going on is a very dangerous thing for a free trade psycho-capitalist. So they began attacking him. It was really interesting what they did, because what they started doing was labeling him as anti-Semitic and a neo-Nazi. And isn't that interesting? Because that's what's going on now. If anyone says anything about Israel, if they don't like the policies of the Zionists over there, like the way they're treating the Palestinians, what happens? What are you called? You're called an anti-Semite. Isn't that interesting? Well, that was going on back then, because he had identified back then what the Zionists were doing to the Palestinians. The Zionists, when they had started setting up Israel and had convinced the United Nations to give them that land, they had been purchasing up parcels of land over there. But when they came in, they immediately seized double the land that they were supposed to have. They took a lot of the Palestinians that were living in different areas that they wanted, like Jerusalem and places like that, and they literally just threw them out on the streets. I have a friend that lived in Lebanon, and his grandparents lived in Jerusalem. And what the Zionists did was they came in and just threw them out of their house, threw all their shit out into the streets, and said, "You're out." Well, that's how you ended up with over 200,000 refugees. That's exactly how you ended up with that. So LaRouche identified that problem and said that needs to end. That is not right, and it's pissing off the Middle East. All the Arabs in the Middle East were very angry about what Israel had done. Israel was very brutal. There's you can find some documentaries on YouTube about how Israel was formed and what they did. and it's very brutal. They would literally drive through towns shooting people. It's a fact. It happened, and anybody that says that it didn't happen, they're going to call you an anti-Semite, of course. So that's what they did. They labeled him that, and then they labeled him a neo-Nazi. And in the early 80s, he ran for president in the Democratic Party, and he ran against Ronald Reagan. They had a debate, and Reagan was there, and LaRouche was there, and several other people that were running at the time. LaRouche was actually kind of a friend with Reagan. They had collaborated together on a few things. Reagan, of course, didn't really understand economics very well, and he listened to a bunch of idiots. But for the most part, LaRouche was labeled an anti-Semite. Well, that's a death blow, as you well know, in the United States. If the media portrays someone as an anti-Semite, in the UK, that went on as well. And you can lose elections that way. The Zionists know that. The American media, the UK media know that. They understand that very, very well, that you can destroy someone's career with certain labels. Well, that's what happened. Now, he continued to publish. He had an organization that got fairly large. I became a member. I used to read a lot of the publications. I used to go to some of the meetings. And what was really ironic was that a lot of the members were actually Jewish. They had gone to Columbia University. The organization had reporters and investigators. They had a lot of contacts in New York and Washington. They were able to uncover a lot of information. Now, what finally broke the camel's back was that in the 80s, while Reagan was president, you probably remember Oliver North, well, with the Iran-Contra situation. What came out finally was that Iran was buying weapons because we were funding them and the Iraqis. We were helping both sides in a war, ironically enough. And so what we were doing was we were bringing in drugs into the United States through Arkansas. Clinton was part of that. He was well known as a cocaine addict. He was running cover for Mena, Arkansas, the airfield. You got Barry Seals. There was a lot of people that were involved. The CIA was involved. And they were taking that money and they were buying weapons to put down into Nicaragua. And they were also selling weapons to Iran, making a huge amount of profit. This is a circle. It was going around and around. It's pretty well known now what happened. But in the 80s, LaRouche identified exactly who was involved, that Oliver North was involved, and that George H.W. Bush was involved. He and Oliver North were running this operation from the executive building and from the White House. Ronald Reagan did not know what was going on, but the CIA did. And maybe you remember that Carter had defunded the CIA because of a lot of what was going on, and there ended up being a lot of unemployed CIA operatives. Well, what did they do? They started private companies which were contractors for the CIA. It gave the CIA the ability to say that we didn't know what was going on. It's these people, it's those people doing it. So it was pretty nasty operation that was going on. And so LaRouche made a few pretty powerful, dangerous enemies. He identified this. I knew about Iran-Contra a year before it was ever in the media in the United States. The story, the media would not talk about it. It finally came to a head when it became so obvious. There was a couple of people that had gotten caught and arrested that were running the drugs into the United States in these airplanes. You had Air America, and then you had the bank in Florida that was laundering the money, and all this stuff started to come out. Well, the media had to start talking about it at that point. So, because LaRouche had identified this in the beginning, and he was publishing other things that were going on, the deep state, which they had a deep state back then, but it was called the shadow government, went after LaRouche. They had to stop him. So they did was they were able to figure out a way, like they always do, find something like tax evasion or some type of fundraising irregularities, things like that, and were able to get an indictment against them and at a trial. Well, it was really interesting because the trial was in Boston, and in Boston, the court, the judge, after listening to all the evidence, realized that LaRouche was right, and he actually issued a subpoena and a warrant to seize George H.W. Bush's office, to seize it, seize all of the materials in his office, confiscate everything as evidence, and immediately it was a mistrial. The government came in and said, oh, nope, can't do that, that's it, we're done. So what they did was they canceled the trial, which is unprecedented, and they moved the trial to Alexandria, and they started all over again. Well, that's kind of like what we call double jeopardy. Well, Ramsey Clark had been the Attorney General in the 70s, and he decided to become LaRouche's attorney. He was the U.S. Attorney General, so it was pretty high-level stuff, because he said you cannot seize a publication organization just because you don't like what they're saying. It cannot be done in the United States. There's this thing, this crazy idea of the First Amendment, that you actually have freedom of speech and freedom of press. Well, that didn't matter to the government at the time. So anyway, in Alexandria, there's a court there. It's well known. It's called the Rocket Docket. And the reason is because in Alexandria, you have a lot of the CIA and military personnel that actually live there. So when you get a jury, it's pretty easy to get a jury that will vote your way. So that's exactly what happened. The court retried the whole thing, but they were not allowed to present the evidence that they had presented in Boston, so they were found guilty, and LaRouche ended up in jail with some of his associates. It's very interesting because when the indictments came through down in Alexandria, they wanted to just take LaRouche out. They didn't even want a trial. So what they had done was they had actually surrounded his farm. He lived on a farm that was donated by a family in Virginia, and the FBI and ATF surrounded the farm, 400 operatives, and you had tanks, you had everything. LaRouche was able to actually get a call into Ronald Reagan, and he told him, look, they're going to try and kill me, you've got to stop this. Reagan personally intervened and broke this off and stopped it. There's nothing he could do about the trial. The trial went on, and they were found guilty. So from then on, the organization fell apart. The publication slowly went away. The organization is still around, but it's much smaller than it ever was because of the labels that the media had placed on them. Once you're labeled as an anti-Semitic or a neo-Nazi, it's pretty much over, because Americans are stupid. They don't know history, they don't understand history, and they believe bullshit in the media, just like today. And there was another thing that happened in Chicago and in Houston. There was the election in 1986, and it was a midterm election. And some of LaRouche's candidates actually won in Chicago and in Houston. They had actually won some delegates. So what ended up happening was the Democratic Party, because they had run in the Democratic Party took those delegates away and said the population that voted for LaRouche and these candidates didn't know who they were voting for, and so they took those delegates away and gave them to someone else. Well, there was a little bit of news about that, but you can see today how the Democratic Party is still playing the same fucking games, screwing around Bernie Sanders and Tulsi Gabbard, the two presidential candidates that were the most dangerous to the status quo and the Democratic Party. The elite, corporatist, the butt smeller, the butt sniffers, the scumbags that carry water for the oligarchy and the 1% that are bought and paid for. So now it's going on, and everybody is shocked and surprised. Oh my God, can you believe this? Well, this was going on in the 80s. This was going on in the 90s. When I was in Los Angeles, when I was still a part of the organization, I ran for what was called a Central Committee office. Every city, most major cities, have what's called a Central Committee of the party. So the Democratic Party and the Republican parties both have what's called a Central Committee. And it's a grassroots organization. It's the very bottom, but it's the people in the neighborhoods that get on this committee, and they are able to present ideas and talk about candidates on a local level. Well, I and some of my friends ran for this office, excuse me, and we actually got into Central Committee. And it was really interesting because one of the top people in the local Democratic Party organization called me up. And in the best McCarthyite way of putting it, he said to me, "Are you now or have you ever been associated with Lyndon LaRouche?" And that was a very interesting way to put it, because that's exactly what McCarthy used to say about people that he would think were communists, or would, attack them as being communists and try to identify them to destroy them. So I said yes, and he said, that's not good. Well, I ran into trouble. All my friends ran into trouble down at the Central Committee, because they used to have a meeting once a month. And we would go to the meeting, and right then was when they were beginning to vote on NAFTA. Now, we knew NAFTA was complete shit. It was the worst treaty. We knew exactly what it was designed to do, is what it did. It destroyed the Mexican economy, and it helped destroy the American economy, because what it did was, it was the North American Free Trade Alliance. It allowed the United States to move factories to Mexico for cheap labor. That was what it was for. And all the bullshit and all the lies about how wonderful and great it was going to be, Clinton pushed it and pushed it. He was actually a pretty awful president. A lot of people still remember him, and wasn't he so wonderful? Well, he's highly involved with the Epstein case. It's well known. Him and his wife are criminals. He's a war criminal, just like George Bush, the W, was a war criminal, because they were bombing countries. They were bombing Iraq even in the 90s without permission by Congress. That's a war crime. And they were pushing this garbage. It was things that the Republicans couldn't even get done. It was the Democrats that were able to push through these horrible, horrible trade agreements. And even Ross Perot at the time, remember, he said that you're going to hear a giant sucking sound of of businesses and industry moving down there. That's one of the reasons now, not necessarily NAFTA, but just this whole notion of companies moving to other countries or moving industries. You have a thing called the Rust Belt, and it's just a term people throw around now. But why is Pittsburgh and Ohio and Michigan and these areas called the Rust Belt? Well, it's because these huge factories were shut down and most of these manufacturing operations were moved to China and Mexico, and so these buildings started to fall apart and got all rusty, and so that's why they call it the Rust Belt. Well, these areas never recovered. They had a lot of good union jobs in these areas. We were making steel, making automobiles, we were making a lot of products. The economy was doing pretty well in the 60s, and even in the 70s we're doing pretty well. But when Reagan got in, he started listening to these morons about how labor unions are really bad, and he started busting up those labor unions. You can see what happened with the airline. Remember the traffic controllers, the union was busted, and they started busting unions. And why did they do that? Specifically because labor unions made sure that the employees got decent wages and decent benefits. Well, if you have a union that's really strong, then a company has to abide by these rules. Well, companies like giant corporations don't like that because they can't make a killing because they have to pay their employees living wages. Well, so when all these things started to fall apart, these companies rushed to China and Mexico for their manufacturing. I mentioned it in one of my last videos. The average wage in Mexico at that time was 57 cents an hour, and I've been to the maquiladoras. I have seen the conditions of the workers where they live. You have open sewer running down the middle of the streets. You have shanty towns, basically cardboard and pieces of metal and whatever people can find to build shelter. It is deplorable. It is disgusting. And Americans are starting to see it now because that's what we're getting here. Look at our our homeless situation. Look at these tent cities that we're getting here in the United States. It's basically the same thing. When you pay someone 57 cents an hour, what kind of shelter are they going to be able to afford? Well, maybe a tent, maybe. We're living in the end game of this. The homeless situation in the United States is out of control. We are falling apart, and Americans don't get it. They don't understand it. Homeless people, most of them can't vote because they have no address. So they can't even register to vote. We've got a terrible situation on our hands. Anyway, I just wanted to talk about this LaRouche situation because it's very interesting that this stuff, the Democratic Party was playing their fucking games back in the 80s. They were keeping people out that they didn't like, and when I was in the Central Committee, some friends of mine and I tried to stop NAFTA. We tried to put in resolutions that NAFTA was a bad idea, that we didn't want it. And the leaders on stage would literally yell, "Shut up and sit down." That's what they told us. We were not allowed to be in any committees. We were ostracized. They played that game at the grassroots level. That's the game that they play. If you don't go along with the status quo, even at the grassroots level, you are ostracized and you are kept from making any kind of inroads. That's the way the game is played. It's been played that way for a long time now. So don't be surprised. Everything that's been going on now, the 2016 election and now 2020, with the fucked up games that the Democratic Party is playing, that they played against Sanders and Tulsi Gabbard, has been going on for a long time. So I'm not surprised. And now with this crackdown of the protesters and the rioters, you've got a huge amount of pent-up anger in this country because this has been going on for a long time. Slowly, 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 the middle class is going away. We are being sucked dry by the 1%. Bernie Sanders identified that, but the media, the people that own the media, the corporate media, like CNN and NBC and MSNBC and Fox, you didn't hear one good thing about Bernie Sanders or Tulsi Gabbard. The game was on. They had to shut them up. They had to keep them down. They had to make sure that they could not get elected, and that was the game that was played. People can see it. A lot of people, progressives, definitely can see it, but most Americans can't. My family are mostly conservatives, and they believe everything they see on Fox. They can't believe that media would lie. Oh my God, how would that? They can't do that. They would never do that. They believe what they hear. And then they regurgitate this shit as if it's true, and they tell their friends, and before you know it, like what I mentioned before, they call me a commie because I like social democratic ideas like is in Europe. I've been to Norway, I've been to Denmark, I've been to Germany and France, and I can tell you that the working class there have it a lot better than we've got it. They have a much better vacation. They have paid leave for childcare. They have better wages. Their taxes are higher, yes. But when I talked to some friends in Norway, I was there for almost a month. I had lunch with these people every day, and they loved the system. There was not one person there that didn't like it because of the benefits they got from their taxes. They got the Medicare for all. They got the free education. They have clean cities. They have clean water. They have a very low homeless population. When I was in a town called Kongsberg, which is a very small town in Norway. There was no homeless people there at all. None. Everything was clean. It was nice, beautiful country. You didn't hear anybody complaining about anything. Couldn't find a McDonald's anywhere. That was very interesting. People in Europe have a much better standard of living, and they eat a lot better too because they don't have a lot of these fast food places that will feed you poison, essentially. They're starting to come in, obviously. You're getting them in some of the larger cities now. But for the most part, people will buy vegetables and things on their way home just to make their meals for a couple of days. They don't buy all this processed food garbage that we eat here today. That's why they have a much lower rate of obesity and heart problems, all kinds of things. The French and the Italians actually have some of the longest lifespans of anyone in the world. Because they walk everywhere. They have mass transit. They have a lot less stress. They get 4 or 5 weeks a year of vacation. Their employees are taken care of. Well, here, the CEOs and the stockholders are king, and the workers are dispensable. They are expendable. You can get rid of them if you need to. You can shut down a company, lay them all off. Who gives a fuck? Because as long as those CEOs are making their hundreds of millions of dollars, and the stockholders are making big bucks by sitting on their big fat asses doing nothing and letting their money make money for them because they're making huge profits moving industries over to these cheap labor pools, they are destroying us. It's coming to a head. We're going to have riots in the streets soon that you can't imagine. It's going to get nasty. It's going to get bloody because the oligarchy doesn't give a shit about the population. They are only worried about their offshore bank accounts. And that's why you'll find people like Jeff Bezos making $13 billion in one day. That is unprecedented. I understand Amazon is huge, especially during the COVID crisis here. A lot of people are ordering things online. Amazon sells half of all the products online. The brick and mortar, as they call them, the stores are going out of business. Everything is going online. And there's nothing wrong with the internet. Thank God we have YouTube still. I don't know how long that's going to last. But what's happening is they're not taxed. The Amazon pays almost no tax. But Jeff Bezos is worth, I don't know, over $100 billion. You've got Bloomberg worth $66 billion. The only way that you can become a billionaire in this country is by destroying people's lives. That's it. There's no other freaking way. And if anybody tries to justify capitalism as a wonderful thing, unbridled free trade capitalism is great because you get an opportunity to better yourself. Well, good luck. Good luck with that. As George Carlin said, it's a big club and you ain't in it. You might be able to work at one of their cocktail parties serving drinks to the elite, but I guarantee you won't be invited to that party as a member. I guarantee it. So all of you conservatives that think that free trade capitalism is a wonderful thing, and I'm going to include the corporate Democrats too, because there are a lot of morons there too. The only group that has a chance is the progressives. That's the only people in this country, the only political movement in this country that has any breath of a chance of doing anything. If we don't get progressives in office soon and try to make some changes, it's going to get nasty here, because they're talking about cutting unemployment again. They're talking about cutting Social Security. They're talking about cutting back everything. And why are they doing that? Because all the money's going to the 1%. That's where it's going, the military-industrial complex. Why are we in the Middle East? To steal natural resources, to control the region. There's no other. We're an empire, but we're a collapsing empire. And right now, what we've got is Nero, Trump Nero, with what they call fiddling while Rome burns. And then we've got the next guy that wants to take his place. I would call Joe Biden Caligula, because these people are all servants to the 1%. They are criminals. They are war criminals. They should be hung, because if you apply the standards from the Nuremberg trials to any one of these presidents in the last 30 years, they will all be considered war criminals, and the people around them are all war criminals. That's one of the reasons why the Democrats wouldn't go after George Bush, is because they were complacent in all of this, going to Iraq and destroying that country. That is one of the world's great tragedies, because the territory of Iraq is the cradle of civilization. That's where the Sumerians came from. And there is a wealth of archaeology in Iraq, and there's no telling how much of that's been destroyed. It's, despite the fact that you've got over 1 million people dead over there, half of those people were women and children, innocent. And you don't hear much about it in the news. Americans don't give a fuck as long as they get what they want, as long as we're a capitalist country and oh my God, we can't be socialist. Well, we are a socialist country already. We're not a very good socialist country, but we have some good programs like Social Security, like the police department and the fire department. The electric grid was built by the government. Dam systems for hydroelectric power built by the government. Highway systems built by the government. Sewer systems built by the government. Fresh water built by the government. You name it. Schools, the elementary and high school, built by the government. Paid for with taxes. The problem is that the bad socialism is the socialism for the rich, because look what happened in 2008. The banks crashed the economy. They knew exactly what they were doing, and they were too big to fail. So what happened? They got bailed out to the tune of trillions of dollars. We've been spending trillions of dollars in the Middle East, and for what? The economy has turned completely upside down. So what they're doing, what the media does, is they turn this socialism word into a really bad word. Oh, can't have socialism in this country. Well, there's good socialism and there's bad socialism. The bad socialism is when the banks come and get bailed out to the tune of trillions of dollars, buy up their own stock, huge corporations getting billions of dollars, buying up their own stock, and the population, the 99% of the population, is going down the toilet. So I predict that very soon, and I don't know if it's going to be a year or two, but very soon we are going to have riots in the streets. It's going to get nasty. It's going to get bloody. And I'm telling you, DC, we're coming for you, okay? Because when we have nothing to lose and we are starving to death and we're fighting over the food that's in the trash cans, I'm telling you that we are coming for you. I do not believe in violence. I do not believe in killing. I do not believe in any of that. I think that it's horrendous. But when you put the American people in a situation where they have nothing to lose and they are starving to death, and they finally see the problem is that the 1% are the ones that have caused all of this, and the politicians, believe me, they're coming for you. And your bunkers won't be deep enough, and your gated community walls won't be high enough, because it's going to happen. I predict it. It's inevitable, unless the progressives get in office and start to change things back to the way things should be. So that's my rant for the day. There's a lot of other things I'd love to talk about, and I'm going to do that. But in the meantime, let's back progressive candidates any way you can. Watch Jimmy Dore. Watch Crystal and Sagar on The Rising. Watch TYT. Watch The Rational National. Watch some of these different shows. There's a lot of good stuff. Watch Blackstone Intelligence. Jake is awesome. He's a really good historian, and he can tell you some stories that will make your hair stand on end. One of the things that he's been discussing lately is the Ghislaine Maxwell situation and Jeff Epstein and the 1%. Once again, who's involved in the pedophilia? The 1%, the billionaires, the rich, the upper class. You got Bill Clinton, and you've got a lot of people involved in this, and there's a lot of people who have a lot to lose. So believe me, she's not going to last long. They're gonna suicide her, I'm telling you, because she's got all the evidence. She knows where all the bodies are, and they cannot allow that. We're dealing with some very rich and powerful people here. Look how Epstein was taken out. I mean, come on. It was so freaking obvious, and the media still says that Epstein committed suicide. Anybody with a sliver of brain knows that that's bullshit. So, there you go. Anyway, look out. It's going to get worse before it gets better. Have a good evening. Thank you.